My parents raised my brother as a prince and treated me like the unpaid help. For 23 years, I cleaned his messes and swallowed their insults. They told me some children were just born to serve. But on his lavish wedding day, while I was on my hands and knees scrubbing a stain out of his tuxedo shirt, an unexpected guest walked into the service hallway. The bride's billionaire father took one look at my face and dropped his phone. He made a single call that would destroy the fake family that had tortured me my entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who tried to keep you down. My name is Melanie. I am 32 years old, and my life completely changed in the chaotic catering kitchen of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The heat in the room was suffocating. Waiters rushed past me with trays of expensive appetizers, and chefs shouted orders over the loud hum of industrial refrigerators. I was kneeling on the hard tile floor, frantically scrubbing a massive red wine spill out of a custom white tuxedo shirt. The harsh chemical smell of the stain remover burned my nose, but I could not stop scrubbing. My brother Garrett had managed to spill an entire glass of vintage Merlot down his front just 20 minutes before his grand wedding reception was supposed to begin. Instead of taking responsibility for his own clumsy mistake, he had simply tossed the ruined shirt at my face and demanded I fix it. I was wearing a beautiful emerald green dress that I had bought with my own hard-earned money, but the hem was now soaking up dirty mop water from the kitchen floor. My hands ached as I rubbed the fabric together, trying to lift the stubborn red pigment from the pristine white cotton. Standing directly above me with her arms crossed was my mother, Linda. She was wearing a pearl-colored gown that cost more than my first car, and her face was twisted into a familiar scowl. "Scrub harder, Melanie," she hissed, her voice cutting through the noise of the kitchen. "The reception starts in exactly 15 minutes, and Garrett cannot walk out there looking like a fool in front of these people. You need to get that stain out right now." I bit my tongue and kept my head down. How did a 32-year-old independent woman end up scrubbing a shirt on a kitchen floor? The answer was simple. Linda had forced me to act as the unpaid wedding coordinator to save the family money. While Garrett enjoyed his lavish bachelor parties and his luxury grooming appointments, I had been running around for 6 months, dealing with vendors, managing spreadsheets, and fixing every single disaster that his terrible planning caused. I had moved out of their house 10 years ago to escape this exact treatment. I went to college, paid my own way, and built a highly successful forensic accounting firm from absolute scratch. I was a professional who tracked hidden assets and unraveled complex financial fraud for major corporate clients. Yet the moment I stepped back into the orbit of my family, I was instantly reduced to the role of a servant. "This is ridiculous," I said quietly, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. If he had just let me hire a professional stain removal service for emergencies, like I suggested, we would not be in this mess. Linda scoffed and tapped her expensive heel against the tile. "We are not wasting money on services when you are perfectly capable of doing it yourself. You owe us for taking you in when nobody wanted you. You were born to serve Garrett, so do it right." Those words hit me like a physical blow. "You owe us for taking you in when nobody wanted you." She threw my adoption in my face every chance she got. From the time I was a little girl growing up in their pristine suburban house, I was reminded daily that I was a charity case. When Garrett was born 2 years after they adopted me, the dynamic shifted entirely. He was their biological miracle, and I was simply the free caregiver they had acquired to make their lives easier. I spent my childhood making his bed, doing his homework, and taking the blame for his tantrums. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy kitchen doors swung open, and my father Thomas marched in. Thomas was a senior commercial banker who cared about nothing more than social status and financial leverage. He adjusted his silk tie and glared down at me, still kneeling on the floor. "Is that shirt ready yet?" he demanded. "I am trying my best," I replied, my hands stinging from the friction. Red wine does not just vanish in 5 minutes. Thomas stepped closer, casting a shadow over me. His voice dropped to a cold, threatening whisper. "If you mess this up, Melanie, I will make one phone call to the commercial lending board. Your accounting firm credit lines will be frozen by Monday morning." I stopped scrubbing and looked up at him in pure disbelief. You would ruin my business over a shirt. I will do whatever it takes to protect my son, he said without an ounce of hesitation. You play your part today. Garrett is marrying a billionaire's daughter and everything must be flawless. Do you understand me? If Jonathan Thorne sees his new son-in-law looking like a sloppy drunk, my bank loses the biggest real estate development account in the state. I am not letting your incompetence ruin this family's future. The sheer audacity of his threat made my blood boil. I had built my forensic accounting firm with zero help from them. I worked 80-hour weeks poring over financial records and building a reputation for absolute integrity. My business was my life, and Thomas knew it. As a senior banker, he actually possessed the connections to freeze my operational capital and trigger a cascade of financial audits that would paralyze my firm for months. He was holding my entire livelihood hostage just to ensure I stayed in my designated place as their obedient servant. I swallowed my pride and looked back down at the damp fabric. I will get it clean, I muttered, suppressing the urge to scream. You had better, Linda added, smoothing her hair. And when you are done with that, you need to go check on the floral arrangements in the main ballroom. I saw a wilted lily in the centerpieces, and it is completely unacceptable. I resumed scrubbing, pushing my fingers to the breaking point. The noise of the catering kitchen continued to roar around me, but I felt completely isolated. The heat, the humiliation, and the sheer injustice of the situation weighed heavily on my shoulders. I promised myself right then and there that this would be the last time. Once this wedding was over, I was cutting contact completely. I did not care what threats Thomas made or what guilt trips Linda tried to lay on me. I was done being the sacrificial lamb on the altar of Garrett's golden life. As I aggressively wrung out the damp shirt, the heavy swinging door that led to the private service hallway opened slightly. I did not look up, assuming it was just another waiter rushing in to grab a fresh tray of champagne glasses. Linda was still hovering over me, continuing her relentless stream of criticism. You missed a spot right by the collar, she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at the wet fabric. Honestly, Melanie, you cannot even do a simple task correctly. It is no wonder you are still single and running that boring little numbers business. If you actually cared about this family, you would have finished this 10 minutes ago. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back tears of absolute frustration. Then the chaotic noise of the kitchen seemed to strangely quiet down. I heard heavy, confident footsteps approach the service hallway. An older man, dressed in a meticulously tailored dark suit, had stepped away from the main reception area, seeking a quiet place to take a private phone call. It was Jonathan Thorne, the bride's father. He was a legendary real estate mogul whose wealth and influence commanded respect across the entire country. He held a sleek phone to his ear, speaking in low, measured tones about a property acquisition. As he paced down the hallway, he glanced through the open service door. He saw me kneeling on the filthy floor. My beautiful dress ruined my hands raw and red. He saw Linda standing above me, sneering and hurling insults. Jonathan stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered the phone from his ear, ending the call without a single word of explanation to whoever was on the other line. I finally looked up, drawn by the sudden silence near the door. My eyes met his. Jonathan Thorne was a man who had seen everything the business world had to offer, but right now he looked like he had just seen a ghost. All the color drained from his weathered face. His mouth parted slightly in absolute shock. He did not look at Linda, and he did not look at the ruined shirt in my hands. His intense, piercing gaze was locked entirely on my face. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Linda finally noticed him standing there, and her entire demeanor changed instantly. Her harsh scowl vanished, replaced by an overly sweet, artificial smile. "Oh, Mr. Thorne," Linda chimed, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "We are so sorry for the delay. We are just dealing with a minor wardrobe malfunction. You know how the hired help can be sometimes." Jonathan did not even acknowledge her words. He took a slow, tentative step forward, his eyes never leaving my features. He looked at the shape of my jaw, the curve of my nose, the exact shade of my eyes. His hand began to tremble. The expensive smartphone slipped from his grip, completely forgotten. It hit the hard tile floor with a sharp crack, the glass screen shattering into a dozen pieces. He did not flinch. He did not look down. He just kept staring at me with an expression of overwhelming, desperate recognition that made my heart race in my chest. The sharp crack of shattered glass echoed against the stainless steel prep tables. Jonathan Thorne did not even blink. The expensive device lay in pieces at his polished leather shoes, completely ignored. His gaze remained locked on me with a terrifying intensity. It was the kind of look that stripped away the chaotic surroundings, making the shouting chefs and clattering pans fade into a dull, distant hum. Linda, entirely misreading the situation, let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. She stepped directly into his line of sight, trying to physically block me from his view. "Mr. Thorne, please forgive this mess," she babbled, her voice tight with artificial sweetness. "We are handling it. She is just clumsy, always has been. I will have the catering manager escort her out through the back so she does not disturb your guests." Jonathan did not respond to my adoptive mother. He did not even look at her. He simply raised one large, weathered hand and pointed a single finger at Linda. "Step away from her," he commanded. His voice was not loud, but it resonated with an absolute, undeniable authority. It was the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions. Linda froze. The fake smile cracked, sliding off her face to reveal genuine panic. She looked back at me, then up at Jonathan, her manicured fingers twitching at her sides. "Excuse me," she stammered. "Mr. Thorne, she is just my daughter. Well, adopted daughter. She is supposed to be working." "I said step away." Jonathan repeated, his tone dropping an octave. Linda slowly took a step backward, her breath hitching. For the first time in my 32 years of life, I saw my mother look genuinely terrified. I pushed myself off the wet floor, my knees aching from the hard tile. I wiped my raw, chemical-soaked hands on the ruined fabric of my green dress. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Why was this powerful man looking at me like he had seen a ghost? Why was he crying? I could see the unmistakable gleam of moisture gathering in the corners of his sharp, perceptive eyes. Jonathan took another slow step toward me, crushing a piece of his broken phone under his heel. His hands were shaking. This titan of industry, a man who possessed a reputation for being ruthless and unshakable, was trembling as he reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy, vintage silver pocket watch. The metal was tarnished with age, etched with an intricate floral pattern that looked decades old. His thumb hovered over the clasp for a second before he pressed it. The watch popped open with a soft click. He looked down at the inside of the lid, then looked up at my face. He did this 3 times, his breathing becoming increasingly shallow and ragged. "It is not possible," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It cannot be." Driven by a sudden, inexplicable pull, I took a tentative step toward him. He did not pull away. Instead, he tilted the pocket watch slightly, allowing me to see what held his attention so fiercely. Inside the lid, opposite the ticking clock face, was a faded photograph protected by a thin layer of glass. It was a picture of a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, laughing at something off camera. The photograph was old, the colors washed out in a sepia tone, but the features were undeniably clear. I stopped breathing. The woman in the photograph had my exact jawline. She possessed the same distinct, slightly arched eyebrows I saw in the mirror every morning. Her nose, the shape of her smile, the exact spacing of her dark eyes, everything was identical. It was not just a passing family resemblance. It was like looking at a photograph of myself taken in a different era, dressed in vintage clothing I had never owned. "Who is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My throat felt incredibly dry. "My younger sister," Jonathan replied, his voice thick with decades of suppressed grief. "Her name was Eleanor. She vanished 32 years ago from a maternity ward in Chicago. She was entirely alone. The police said she ran away. I never believed them. I searched for her every day of my life until she was found in a car accident months later, but her baby was gone." The kitchen seemed to spin. 32 years ago, I was 32 years old. Chicago. My adoption paperwork had always been a sensitive, forbidden topic in our house. Linda had always claimed it was a closed adoption handled by a private agency that had long since gone bankrupt. Whenever I asked for details about my biological family, Thomas would become enraged, accusing me of being ungrateful for the life they had graciously provided. "Mr. Thorne, this is highly inappropriate," Linda suddenly shrieked. Her voice bordered on hysterical. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a painful, bruising grip. "You are confusing her. She is my daughter. We adopted her legally. We have all the paperwork. Melanie, get back to work right now. Go check the floral arrangements." Linda yanked my arm so hard I nearly stumbled. Her desperation was palpable, radiating from her in waves of frantic energy. She was not just angry anymore. She was cornered. Jonathan moved faster than I thought possible for a man his age. He stepped between us and shoved Linda's hand off my arm with physical force. "Do not touch her," he snarled. The sadness in his eyes was instantly replaced by a terrifying, protective fury. He stood between me and the woman who had tormented me for my entire life, shielding me with his own body. Linda stumbled back, clutching her wrist, her chest heaving. "Thomas!" she screamed toward the kitchen doors. "Thomas, get in here!" Jonathan ignored her screaming. He turned his back on Linda and focused entirely on me. His expression softened again, returning to that desperate, seeking vulnerability. "When Eleanor was a baby," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a gentle, pleading whisper, "she had a very specific mark. It was genetic. Our grandmother had the same one. When Eleanor's baby went missing, the police reports documented it as an identifying feature. A small, pale mark shaped perfectly like a crescent moon." He took a deep breath, his eyes locked on mine. "Your left collarbone, please. I need to know. Is there a mark?" My hand instinctively flew to my neck. Beneath the fabric of my ruined, water-stained green dress resting exactly on my left collarbone was the birthmark I had carried my entire life. Growing up, Linda had constantly told me it was ugly. She used to make me wear high-necked shirts and turtlenecks to cover it up, claiming it made me look dirty. She had even researched laser removal surgery when I was a teenager, insisting it was a blemish on the family's perfect image. "Melanie, do not do it!" Linda screamed. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the stainless steel walls. "Do not show him anything. You belong to us. We raised you. We fed you." I looked at Linda, taking in her wide, panicked eyes and her trembling hands. The woman who had spent 23 years treating me like a servant, who had allowed her husband to threaten my business mere minutes ago, was now begging me to hide a piece of my own body. She was terrified of the truth. I turned my back on my adoptive mother and faced Jonathan Thorne. My hands were still raw and aching from scrubbing Garrett's tuxedo shirt, but I reached up to the neckline of my dress. With a slow, deliberate motion, I pulled the fabric aside, exposing my left collarbone to the harsh fluorescent lights of the catering kitchen. There it sat against my skin. A small, distinct crescent-shaped birthmark. Jonathan stared at the mark. A profound, shattering silence fell over the three of us. He reached out a trembling hand, hovering his fingers just inches above the skin, without actually touching me, as if he were afraid I was an illusion that might vanish if he made contact. A single tear escaped his eye, cutting a path down his cheek. Then another followed. The powerful, untouchable billionaire was weeping openly, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a 32-year-old mystery finally crashing to a halt. "Eleanor's girl," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of agony and overwhelming joy. "You are Eleanor's girl." Behind us, the kitchen doors burst open. Thomas rushed in, his face red with anger, demanding to know why his wife was screaming. I barely registered his arrival. The entire world had narrowed down to the vintage pocket watch, the faded photograph of the mother I never knew, and the man standing in front of me. Jonathan took a deep, steadying breath. He straightened his posture, wiping the tears from his face with the back of his hand. His demeanor shifted instantly from a grieving brother to a man ready for war. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a second, smaller cell phone. He dialed a number, holding the phone to his ear, his intense blue eyes never leaving my face. The ringing stopped as someone answered on the other end. "Cancel the wedding," Jonathan said into the receiver. His voice was absolute steel, echoing through the kitchen, freezing Thomas and Linda exactly where they stood. "I found her." The words hung in the sterile air of the catering kitchen like a physical weight. "Cancel the wedding." Thomas lunged forward, his face purple with rage, completely abandoning his polished banker persona. He demanded to know what Jonathan thought he was doing, screaming about vendor contracts and his family reputation. Jonathan simply turned his back on him. He gestured for his personal security team, who had materialized from the main hallway the moment his voice was raised. Two massive men in dark suits stepped seamlessly between me and my adoptive parents. Linda was sobbing now, a loud theatrical wail that echoed off the stainless steel appliances, but her eyes were darting frantically, looking for an escape route. She knew. I could see it in her rigid posture and the sudden terrifying pallor of her skin. She knew exactly why Jonathan Thorne was looking at my collarbone. Jonathan gently placed his hand on my shoulder and guided me toward the back exit. We left Thomas shouting into the void, the lavish wedding of Garrett crashing down around them in spectacular fashion. I later learned that Jonathan walked straight into the main ballroom, took the microphone from the wedding band, and announced to 400 wealthy guests that the event was terminated immediately. He offered no further explanation. He just gathered his daughter, the bewildered bride, and walked out. For the next 3 days, my phone did not stop ringing. Thomas and Linda left dozens of voicemails swinging wildly between vicious threats to ruin my accounting firm and pathetic sobbing apologies begging me to come home so we could talk as a family. Garrett left a single venomous text message blaming me for destroying his perfect life and his chance at a billionaire lifestyle. I blocked all of their numbers without a second thought. I sat in my small apartment, staring at the blank walls, waiting for the one call that actually mattered. The call came on a Tuesday morning. A private driver arrived at my apartment building in a sleek black town car tasked with bringing me to the Thorne corporate headquarters downtown. The building was a towering monolith of glass and steel, a physical manifestation of Jonathan's immense power and influence. I was escorted past multiple strict security checkpoints, bypassing the crowded public lobby entirely, and taken straight to the top floor via a private elevator. The executive suite was eerily silent, heavily insulated from the noise of the bustling city below. Jonathan was waiting for me in a massive corner office that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the skyline. He looked exhausted. The sharp, commanding billionaire from the country club kitchen was gone, replaced by an aging man carrying the crushing weight of a 32-year-old ghost. He gestured for me to sit in a heavy leather chair across from his sprawling mahogany desk. A thick manila folder rested on the polished wood exactly between us. Beside him stood a quiet, highly observant man, introduced as his lead private investigator. My heart hammered against my ribs with violent force. I had spent my entire life believing I was a disposable problem, a child abandoned by whoever gave birth to me and graciously tolerated by the people who took me in out of pity. The simple folder on the desk held the absolute power to shatter that painful narrative permanently. Jonathan slid the folder slowly across the desk. His hands were remarkably steady today. "Open it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and flipped back the heavy cardstock cover. The first page was a highly detailed laboratory report from an expedited DNA analysis. I am a forensic accountant. I look at complex documents, data points, and statistical probabilities for a living. My eyes immediately bypassed the medical jargon and dropped straight to the conclusion printed boldly at the bottom of the page. Probability of biological relationship 99.9%. I stared at the numbers until the ink blurred on the paper. I looked up at Jonathan, my mind struggling to form a complete rational sentence. "You are my niece," Jonathan said, his voice breaking on the final word as a tear slipped down his weathered cheek. "You are the biological daughter of my late sister Eleanor. You were not given up for adoption. You were not abandoned by a mother who did not want you. You were loved fiercely from the very second you were born." The tears I had been fighting back for 3 days finally spilled over. I could not stop them. All those years of Linda telling me I owed them my life for taking me in when nobody else wanted me. All those years of feeling like a massive burden, a charity case, an unwanted secret that they generously clothed and fed. It was all a complete and utter lie. I was wanted. I had a biological mother who had loved me. But the profound relief of that beautiful truth was instantly swallowed by a dark, terrifying, and logical question. If I was not given up for adoption voluntarily, how did I end up in the custody of Thomas and Linda? I looked at the private investigator, my chest tightening with a sudden wave of dread. What happened to my mother? I demanded, my voice trembling with newfound urgency. Jonathan closed his eyes tightly, taking a deep, shuddering breath before nodding to the investigator to explain the horrific details. The investigator stepped forward and placed a second, much thicker stack of papers on the desk. These were old employment records, police reports from 3 decades ago, and heavily redacted hospital security logs. 32 years ago, the investigator began in a steady, professional tone. Your mother, Eleanor, gave birth to you at a highly secure private hospital in Chicago. 2 days after your birth, you vanished from the maternity ward without a single trace. The security cameras on that specific floor had conveniently malfunctioned during a 10-minute window. The hospital staff was thoroughly questioned by local authorities, but no viable leads were ever found. Your mother was completely devastated. She spent every waking moment of her life searching for you, distributing flyers, and hiring private detectives, until she tragically passed away in a car accident a few months later. I reached out and gently touched the vintage photograph of Eleanor that Jonathan had placed next to the DNA results. My mother. She had died looking for me. Her entire life ended in a state of absolute agony because I was taken from her. The profound injustice of it burned like acid in my throat. But how did Thomas and Linda get me? I demanded, my voice rising with a mixture of grief and boiling anger. Did they buy me from a black market broker? The investigator shook his head, his expression turning incredibly grim. It was much more direct and far more sinister than that. We pulled the employment records from that specific Chicago hospital for the exact year you were born. We then cross-referenced the hospital staff list with the adoption paperwork Thomas and Linda filed in another state exactly 6 months later. The investigator slid a faded, laminated employment badge across the polished desk. It featured a much younger picture of Linda. She was wearing a crisp white nursing uniform. Linda was a maternity nurse at that exact hospital in Chicago, the investigator stated flatly. She was officially fired 2 weeks before you were born for suspected medication theft, but she still retained her physical access keys because the hospital administration failed to collect them. The adoption papers they filed later were complete sophisticated forgeries. Thomas used his early connections in the banking sector to bribe a corrupt local notary and a judge who was later disbarred for similar fraudulent crimes. Melanie, you were not adopted. You were abducted. The words echoed in the massive office, bouncing off the glass walls. Abducted, stolen, kidnapped. Linda did not take me in out of the goodness of her cold heart. She literally stole me from my biological mother's arms. She robbed Eleanor of her only child and robbed me of my real loving family. And then, as if the kidnapping itself was not evil enough, she spent the next 3 decades treating me like an unpaid indentured servant. She punished me daily for existing, demanding endless gratitude for her monstrous crime. She had intentionally used me as a free built-in caregiver for Garrett, her biological golden child, raising him as an entitled prince, while I scrubbed his floors, cooked his meals, and fixed his endless mistakes. A cold, incredibly dangerous fury settled over me. It was not the chaotic, tearful anger of a wounded, rejected child. It was the precise, highly calculated rage of a professional woman who destroyed financial criminals and liars for a living. I gathered the certified DNA results, the forged adoption papers, and Linda's old hospital badge. I placed them meticulously back into the manila folder and stood up from the leather chair. Jonathan stood with me, his face tight with concern for my well-being. We have federal agents on standby, ready to move right now, he said firmly. We can have them both arrested and sitting in a holding cell by the end of the day. I shook my head, my grip tightening on the heavy folder until my knuckles turned white. Not yet, I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. Federal agents will just put them behind bars immediately. That is far too easy and far too quick. I want them to look me in the eye when their entire world burns to the ground. I want to see their faces when they realize their lifelong victim is the one holding the match. I turned and walked out of the executive suite, my heels clicking sharply and purposefully against the marble floor. I marched straight out of the Thorn building and got directly into my car. I did not drive to my accounting office. I did not go home to rest or process the trauma. I drove directly toward the affluent, quiet suburbs, gripping the steering wheel as a plan formed perfectly in my analytical mind. I pulled up to the pristine, perfectly manicured lawn of the house I grew up in. I grabbed the folder, marched up the brick pathway with absolute purpose, and prepared to kick down the front door of my abusers. I lifted my foot and drove my heel directly into the heavy mahogany front door of my childhood home. The wood splintered violently around the deadbolt with a deafening crack. The door burst inward, hitting the foyer wall so hard it left a dent in the pristine floral wallpaper. I did not pause or hesitate. I marched straight through the entryway, my flat shoes stomping heavily against the imported hardwood floors. I found Thomas and Linda in the formal dining room. They were sitting at the expansive glass table, casually eating a catered lunch of salmon and roasted asparagus. They had clearly returned from the ruined country club reception and decided to simply carry on with their afternoon. The sheer normalcy of the scene felt offensive. Thomas had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Linda was elegantly sipping from a crystal wine glass, looking completely unbothered. They both jumped slightly when the front door smashed open, but their expressions quickly morphed into extreme irritation rather than fear. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas barked, standing up from his chair. "Have you lost your mind, Melanie? I will have you arrested for property damage." I ignored his blustering threats. I walked straight up to the dining table and slammed the thick manila folder down onto the glass surface. The heavy slap of the cardboard echoed in the large room. The documents spilled out, forming a damning mosaic across the table. The expedited DNA results showing a 99.9% biological match to Jonathan Thorne lay right next to the forged adoption papers and the faded photocopy of Linda's old hospital employment badge. I waited for the panic. I braced myself for the desperate tears, the frantic denials, or the sudden collapse of their perfect suburban facade. I expected Linda to drop to her knees and beg for mercy now that her monstrous secret was exposed to the light of day. I expected Thomas to scramble for excuses or blame his wife to save his own skin. Instead, Thomas slowly picked up the DNA report. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the document. Then he did the unthinkable. He chuckled. A low, dry, genuinely amused chuckle escaped his lips. He tossed the paper back onto the table and looked at his wife. "Well, Linda," Thomas said, his voice completely devoid of anxiety. "It seems the billionaire finally figured it out. Took him long enough." Linda did not faint. She did not cry or hyperventilate. She calmly reached for the chilled bottle of Chardonnay resting in the silver ice bucket on the table. She poured herself another generous glass filled to the brim. She took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the taste before setting the glass down. She looked at me with an expression of chilling, absolute smugness. Her manicured fingers drummed lightly against the table. "I always knew this day might come," Linda said casually, as if we were discussing the weather rather than a profound felony. "You have his sister's eyes. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed the resemblance. But honestly, Melanie, kicking down our door like a wild animal is just incredibly bad manners. We raised you better than that." Their sheer audacity paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. I am a forensic accountant who dismantles corporate criminals for a living. But the complete lack of basic human empathy in front of me was staggering. There was no remorse. There was no shame. They were sitting in their multi-million-dollar home, drinking expensive wine and smiling at the woman they had kidnapped 3 decades ago. Why, I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. Why did you do it? Why did you steal me from a mother who loved me? Why did you destroy her life just to bring me here and treat me like absolute garbage? Linda sighed dramatically, leaning back in her plush dining chair. She looked at me with an expression of profound boredom. It was a simple matter of convenience, Melanie. You have to understand the context of the time. 32 years ago, I was desperate for a child. Thomas was building his career in the banking sector, and corporate executives were expected to have perfect little families. A barren wife was a social liability. We tried the adoption agencies, but they were taking entirely too long. They asked too many intrusive questions. They wanted background checks and financial audits and psychological evaluations. We simply did not have the patience for the bureaucracy. She took another sip of wine. Then I was assigned to the maternity ward at that private hospital in Chicago. I saw Eleanor Thorne. She was a wealthy young single mother recovering from a difficult delivery. The security on that floor was a complete joke. It was shockingly easy to manipulate the camera feeds and walk out the back exit with a sleeping newborn hidden in a laundry cart. We did not take you because we had some grand vendetta against the Thorne family. We took you because you were there and we needed a baby to secure our image. It was a practical acquisition. My blood ran cold. A practical acquisition. She spoke about stealing a human life the same way someone would speak about purchasing a new handbag to match a pair of shoes. But if you wanted a child so badly, I countered, my hands curling into tight fists at my sides. Why did you treat me like a disease my entire life? Why did you constantly tell me I was a burden? Thomas wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and joined the conversation, his tone incredibly matter-of-fact. Because the situation changed 2 years later, he explained. We experienced a medical miracle. Linda got pregnant naturally with Garrett. Suddenly, we had our own biological son. Our real flesh and blood. You were no longer necessary for the family image. In fact, you became a rather annoying liability. Linda smiled a terrifyingly proud smile that made my stomach turn. We actually considered returning you or leaving you at a fire station, she admitted without an ounce of hesitation. But Thomas, being the brilliant financial mind that he is, saw a unique opportunity. Why throw away a perfectly functioning asset? We realized we were going to need someone to look after our precious Garrett. Nannies and tutors and housekeepers are incredibly expensive, but an older sister, an adopted girl who owes us her very existence because we graciously kept a roof over her head. That is free labor. The monstrous reality of my existence clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They did not just steal me to fulfill a twisted maternal fantasy. They kept me to use as an unpaid indentured servant. We raised you to be a free built-in caregiver for Garrett, Linda stated proudly. And you performed your duties beautifully, Melanie. You cooked his meals. You cleaned his room. You did his science projects. You took the blame when he broke the neighbor's windows. You saved us tens of thousands of dollars in childcare expenses over the years. We gave you basic food and a small bed, and you paid us back in total submission. It was an excellent return on our initial investment. The rage inside me shifted from a low boil to an explosive, roaring inferno. I slammed my hands down on the glass table, leaning in until I was inches from their smug faces. I promise you, I hissed, every word dripping with absolute venom. I promise you both that you will rot in federal prison for the rest of your natural lives. Jonathan Thorne has an army of the most ruthless lawyers in the country. They are drafting the criminal charges right now. You are going to lose this house. You are going to lose your banking career. You are going to lose Garrett. I will personally make sure you are locked in a cage until the day you die. Instead of cowering, Thomas stood up. He calmly buttoned his tailored vest and leaned over the table, mirroring my aggressive posture. The arrogant smirk on his face widened, exposing his perfectly capped teeth. He looked at me with the supreme confidence of a man who held all the winning cards. You really should have stuck to your little accounting spreadsheets, Melanie. He mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. You clearly do not understand the law. He picked up the DNA results and casually tossed them into the trash can next to the dining table. You think you have us trapped? Thomas continued, crossing his arms over his chest. You think your new billionaire daddy is going to send the FBI to kick down our doors and drag us away in handcuffs? You are incredibly naive. I planned for this exact scenario decades ago. I am a senior banker. I understand risk management better than anyone. I consulted top-tier legal experts 30 years ago under the guise of hypothetical research. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine with chilling triumph. The statute of limitations for kidnapping in the state of Illinois, where the incident occurred, is long gone. The statute of limitations for the document forgery, the identity theft, and the fraudulent adoption paperwork expired when you were just a teenager. We cannot be prosecuted for taking you. We cannot be charged with a single crime related to your abduction. The legal window closed years ago. Linda walked up beside her husband, wrapping her arm around his waist and resting her head on his shoulder. They looked like a picture-perfect couple posing for a magazine cover. You can go cry to the local news, Linda chimed in, a vicious smile twisting her lips. You can run to your new rich family and tell them all the horrible things we did to you. But legally, we are absolutely bulletproof. No prosecutor will touch a case that expired 15 years ago. No judge will sign an arrest warrant. You have zero legal recourse. Thomas chuckled again, turning his back on me to retrieve his wineglass. You lose, Melanie, he said, tossing the words over his shoulder. We got exactly what we wanted from you. We got our free labor. We raised our perfect biological son. And now we get to walk away without a single consequence. You can see yourself out. We won. Before I could even process the sheer sociopathy of Thomas claiming they had won, the ruined front door was shoved violently backward. The splintered wood scraped harshly against the expensive floorboards. Garrett stormed into the formal dining room, entirely shattering the calm, arrogant atmosphere his parents had just established. My golden child brother was no longer wearing his custom-tailored wedding tuxedo. Instead, he was dressed in a wrinkled designer tracksuit, his hair disheveled and his face blotchy with a mixture of physical exertion and pure, unadulterated rage. He had clearly rushed straight from the airport, returning early from what was supposed to be a luxurious month-long honeymoon in the Maldives. His new bride, the billionaire heiress, was nowhere in sight. Garrett did not stop to ask why the front door was kicked in. He did not ask why there were genetic testing documents scattered across the glass dining table. He marched directly up to me, his hands balled into tight fists, his chest heaving. Do you have any idea what you just did to me? Garrett screamed, his voice cracking with fury. I looked at him, waiting for the horrific realization to dawn on his face. I waited for him to process the fact that his parents were kidnappers, that his entire life was subsidized by a heinous crime against my biological mother. But that realization never came. Garrett did not care about the abduction. He did not care about the forged documents or the 32 years of lies. Jonathan Thorne completely pulled the plug, Garrett yelled, kicking an empty dining chair so hard it toppled over and crashed against the wall. His security team literally escorted me out of the country club. My fiancé will not even answer my phone calls. Her father froze the wedding accounts, canceled the private jet to the honeymoon, and revoked my access to the Thorne real estate portfolio. I was going to use her family money to secure the next funding round for my tech startup. You ruined everything. You ruined the entire family vibe just because you are a jealous, bitter loser. I stared at the man I had spent my entire life serving. I had cooked his meals, cleaned his messes, and protected him from the consequences of his own reckless behavior for over 2 decades. And his only reaction to learning that I was stolen from a hospital ward was sheer annoyance that I had disrupted his cash flow. Garrett, darling, please calm down, Linda cooed, stepping forward to rub his tense shoulders. We are handling it. She is just throwing a temper tantrum. It does not matter what she told the Thorns. We are legally untouchable. Garrett shoved her hand away, glaring at me with absolute hatred. You could not just keep your mouth shut and scrub the shirt, he sneered. You always have to make everything about you. You owe us for everything you have. I swear to God, Melanie, I am going to make you pay for ruining my wedding. I did not scream back at him. I did not throw anything. The roaring inferno of anger inside me had crystallized into something completely different. It was a cold, sharp, and absolute terrifying clarity. I looked at Linda, then at Thomas, and finally at Garrett. They were not a family. They were a syndicate of parasites. "Keep your empty threats, Garrett," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "You are going to need all your energy for the reality check that is coming your way." I turned my back on them and walked out of the house. I stepped over the splintered remains of the front door, walked down the pristine brick pathway, and got into my car. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as I drove away from the suburban nightmare that had been my prison. The next morning, I arrived at the downtown high-rise building that housed my forensic accounting firm. I needed to dive into my work to process the absolute chaos of the previous 24 hours. But the moment I stepped off the elevator, I knew something was horribly wrong. The reception area was tense. My operations manager rushed up to me holding a stack of printed financial statements, looking incredibly panicked. "Melanie, we have a massive problem," my manager said, following me hurriedly into my private office. "The commercial bank just flagged all of our corporate accounts for suspicious activity. They completely froze our operational credit lines at 8 o'clock this morning. We cannot process outbound payments, we cannot access our cash reserves, and we cannot make payroll on Friday." I stopped in my tracks, my briefcase slipping from my hand and hitting the carpet. Thomas. He had actually made good on his threat. He was a senior executive at that exact commercial bank. He knew exactly which levers to pull and which bureaucratic loopholes to exploit to choke out a small business. He was using his banking leverage to cut off my financial oxygen, hoping to force me into submission before I could leverage my new connection to Jonathan Thorne. He wanted to bleed me out, panic my employees, and destroy the firm I had built with my own 2 hands. "Call the secondary lenders," I instructed my manager, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Reroute the incoming client retainers to our backup accounts at the credit union. He thinks he can starve me out, but he is underestimating how securely I built this company. I will handle the bank." I spent the next 3 hours fighting through aggressive bureaucratic red tape, arguing with banking compliance officers who suddenly refused to return my calls. The sheer power Thomas wielded in the financial sector was terrifying. He was actively destroying my livelihood, completely unbothered by the fact that he was crushing the woman he had raised. Needing a moment to breathe and clear my head, I stepped out of my office building to grab a coffee from the cafe across the street. The crisp city air helped cool the frustration burning in my chest. As I waited at the crosswalk, a man in a beige windbreaker stepped directly into my path. He had a plain, unremarkable face and held a thick manila envelope in his hand. "Melanie?" he asked, his tone perfectly neutral. "Yes," I replied, my guard instantly going up. He shoved the thick envelope directly against my chest. "You have been served," he stated flatly. He turned on his heel and disappeared into the lunchtime crowd before I could even process what had just happened. I stood on the sidewalk, the loud city traffic buzzing around me, and stared at the heavy envelope. I ripped the seal open and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents printed on thick watermarked paper. I flipped to the summary page, scanning the legal jargon with my trained eyes. It was a civil lawsuit filed in the state superior court. The plaintiffs were Thomas and Linda. The defendant was me. I read the specific demands and my jaw actually dropped. They were not suing me for defamation. They were not suing me for emotional distress. They were suing me for $1.5 million in retroactive child-rearing expenses. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of absolute unhinged audacity. Thomas's expensive lawyers had drafted a claim stating that because my adoption was technically rendered invalid due to clerical errors, their wording for kidnapping, they had essentially operated as a private, uncontracted foster care service for 23 years. They had attached a meticulously itemized ledger to the lawsuit. They were charging me for every meal I had ever eaten under their roof. They were charging me for the cheap clothes they bought me, the water I used to shower, the electricity I consumed in my tiny bedroom, and the basic public school supplies they purchased. They even prorated the cost of my childhood braces with compound interest. They were demanding $1.5 million in compensation for keeping me alive. It was a classic aggressive intimidation tactic. It was a frivolous lawsuit designed solely to bleed me dry with exorbitant legal fees. They knew my credit lines were frozen. They knew I was vulnerable. They were trying to drown me in litigation, so I would be too busy fighting for my financial survival to focus on exposing their crimes. They wanted to crush my spirit and force me to beg for mercy. I stood on the bustling sidewalk, gripping the lawsuit so tightly the paper crumpled in my hands. I looked at the itemized list of my childhood expenses. I looked at the demand for $1.5 million. And then right there in the middle of the street, I smiled. I did not panic. I did not cry. I did not feel the crushing weight of despair that Thomas and Linda were counting on. Instead, a wave of cold, brilliant satisfaction washed over me. The smile grew into a soft, genuine laugh that earned me a few strange looks from passing pedestrians. Thomas was a senior banker who had just committed a fatal, arrogant tactical error. He was so used to bullying people with his wealth and legal power that he forgot exactly what I did for a living. When you file a civil lawsuit against someone for financial compensation, you open the door to a legal process called discovery. By demanding $1.5 million based on their historical financial expenditures, Thomas and Linda had just given my defense attorneys the absolute legal right to subpoena their entire financial history. They had just opened their books to the court. They had officially invited a licensed forensic accountant to look directly into their finances through mandatory legal discovery. They wanted to play a game of numbers. They wanted to weaponize their bank accounts and use the legal system to audit my childhood. They had no idea they had just handed me the master key to their destruction. A corrupt banker who commits kidnapping and forgery definitely has offshore accounts, hidden assets, and dirty ledgers. And now I had the legal authority to rip through 30 years of their financial history and drag every single one of their secrets into the light. I tucked the lawsuit under my arm, turned around, and walked back into my office building. My firm's credit lines were frozen, but I did not need their money. I needed my software. I marched into my private office, locked the door, and fired up my encrypted servers. The real war was not going to be fought with shouting matches in their dining room. It was going to be fought right here in the digital trenches where I never lost. The glow of my multiple monitors illuminated the dark office as I began drafting the formal discovery requests. My phone vibrated intensely against the mahogany desk. The caller identification displayed Jonathan Thorne. He had already been notified about the frivolous lawsuit through his vast network of legal contacts. When I answered, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble of protective fury. He was absolutely livid that the people who had stolen me were now attempting to bleed me dry through the civil courts. Jonathan offered to unleash his elite tier of corporate litigators, a team of legal sharks who could bury Thomas and Linda in countersuits and crush their frivolous claim before the weekend. I listened to my biological uncle, feeling a profound, unfamiliar warmth at having someone fiercely and unconditionally defending me, but I calmly instructed him to stand down. I explained that a quick brute force dismissal would only save Thomas from the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless arrogance. By formally suing me for historical financial compensation, Thomas had legally obligated himself to open his books. I told Jonathan that this was my specific battlefield. I was going to dissect their entire lives line by line, transaction by transaction. Jonathan paused for a long moment, the silence heavy on the line, before he let out a sharp, deeply approving laugh. He told me to show absolutely no mercy. I promised him I would not. The very next morning, my defense attorney filed the most aggressive discovery demands our state superior court had seen in a decade. We did not merely request basic tax returns or standard bank statements. We legally demanded 30 years of comprehensive financial records, property deeds, investment portfolios, trust structures, and offshore asset declarations. We specifically subpoenaed the complete unredacted operational ledgers for Garrett's heavily hyped tech startup, arguing that family funds might be illegally commingled there. The trap was officially and permanently sprung. To process the incoming avalanche of financial data, I activated my firm's most specialized network. I called in favors from former federal financial investigators I had partnered with in the past and deployed my firm's proprietary data scraping software. We built a massive digital dragnet, designed to automatically flag routing anomalies, phantom limited liability companies, and mismatched capital gains. For 3 consecutive days, I barely slept. I lived on black coffee and pure, unadulterated adrenaline, watching the loading bars on my screens as the court-ordered data streams began to populate my encrypted, isolated servers. It took exactly 4 days for Thomas to realize he had walked blindly into a devastating financial minefield. The panic manifested in a sudden, frantic flurry of emergency legal filings. Thomas hired a notoriously ruthless corporate defense firm to file immediate injunctions to stop my audit. They aggressively demanded the discovery phase be sealed and severely restricted, citing strict banking secrecy laws, corporate confidentiality clauses, and proprietary trade secrets regarding Garrett's startup technology. They argued vehemently that my requests were an invasive, irrelevant, and vindictive overreach designed solely to harass upstanding citizens. We ended up in a sterile downtown courtroom by the end of the week to battle over the injunctions. Thomas sat at the plaintiff's table looking immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit projecting an aura of untouchable wealth, but my trained eyes caught the nervous sweat glistening on his forehead. He kept tapping his expensive pen against the desk, a telltale sign of his spiraling anxiety. His high-priced lawyers argued eloquently about privacy rights and the absolute irrelevance of 30-year-old bank statements to a modern civil dispute over child-rearing costs. I sat beside my own legal counsel, utterly and terrifyingly composed. When it was our turn to speak, I simply handed my lawyer a single sheet of paper containing our core argument. We presented a precedent-setting, undeniable logic to the judge. Thomas and Linda had voluntarily based their $1.5 million demand on their historical lifestyle costs, explicitly claiming my presence severely drained their financial resources over 2 decades. Therefore, their entire financial history, the exact source, flow, and volume of their wealth during those specific decades, was directly and legally relevant to validating their civil claim. They could not demand compensation for poverty while hiding their assets. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for corporate stalling tactics, agreed entirely with our assessment. She slammed her wooden gavel down with a sharp crack and unequivocally denied every single one of Thomas's injunctions. She ordered full, unredacted access to their personal and corporate encrypted servers and gave his legal team exactly 48 hours to comply or face immediate contempt of court charges. Thomas looked absolutely ill as he walked out of the courtroom, his pristine posture crumbling under the weight of his colossal miscalculation. The digital floodgates opened the following Monday morning. Terabytes of raw, unfiltered financial data poured directly into my secure network. I decided to start my dissection with Garrett. His tech startup was constantly featured in local business magazines, loudly hailed as the next major disruptor in artificial intelligence and machine learning. I ran his operational ledgers through my forensic algorithms, hunting for the structural integrity of his business. It took less than 2 hours for the software to highlight glaring, massive inconsistencies. There was absolutely no revenue originating from actual software sales or legitimate licensing agreements. The massive capital keeping the company afloat was entirely composed of continuous aggressive funding rounds from wealthy private investors. But that money was not going into research development or coding infrastructure. It was being systematically routed through a labyrinth of shell companies and immediately utilized to pay out early investors with the fresh capital raised from the new ones. Garrett was running a textbook, highly illegal Ponzi scheme. He was rapidly siphoning millions of dollars into dummy accounts to aggressively fund his luxury sports cars, his designer tracksuits, his lavish international vacations, and his superficial billionaire lifestyle, while his actual company was a hollow, decaying shell, completely devoid of real technology. But discovering Garrett's pathetic, desperate fraud was just the appetizer. I pivoted my intense focus to the primary architect of this entire nightmare. I began tracing Thomas's 30-year banking career with surgical precision. He was an undeniable master at covering his tracks heavily, utilizing layered accounts in overseas jurisdictions renowned for absolute banking secrecy. He employed complex integration techniques to wash dirty money into clean real estate investments. But no one is completely invisible, especially not to someone who knows exactly where the digital shadows fall. I initiated a relentless deep dive into his oldest, most heavily guarded offshore ledgers. I cross-referenced highly anomalous wire transfers with his domestic asset acquisitions, looking for the tiny digital fingerprints he inevitably left behind. I wrote custom decryption scripts to aggressively bypass his outdated legacy security protocols. Lines of complex code cascaded rapidly across my monitors as I worked late into the night, the only sound in the building being the frantic rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Around 3 in the morning, the decryption software finally cracked his oldest, most heavily guarded offshore account based in the Cayman Islands. The hidden ledger snapped open on my center monitor, illuminating the dark room with harsh white light. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the heavily obfuscated, deliberately confusing transactions. I effortlessly traced the money flowing from domestic accounts belonging to vulnerable elderly banking clients directly into Thomas's private, untraceable holdings. He had been quietly and systematically skimming millions from the retirement funds of innocent people for over a decade to secretly fund Garrett's failing startup and keep the grand illusion alive. But that was not what made my blood run ice cold. I scrolled down to the very bottom of the ancient ledger, tracing the origin of the account back to its exact creation date, 32 years ago. I stared at the initial massive cash deposit that had single-handedly seeded Thomas's entire lucrative banking career. I ran the numbers through the database Jonathan Thorne had provided me regarding the historical police investigation. The numbers aligned with a sickening, horrifying precision. The entire family empire was an illusion, a house of cards built entirely on a foundation of structural, highly illegal rot. The morning after I initiated the deepest layers of my forensic audit, my phone began vibrating uncontrollably on my nightstand. It was barely 6 o'clock. I reached over expecting an early update from my lead financial investigator, but the notifications flooding my locked screen were urgent news alerts and frantic text messages from concerned colleagues. I clicked on a link sent by my operations manager. It opened directly to a live, high-definition broadcast from the most prominent local news network in the state. They're sitting on a plush velvet sofa in a brightly lit television studio were Thomas and Linda, panicking about the massive legal discovery phase that was about to rip their financial history wide open. They had run straight to the local media. They had hired a notoriously sleazy public relations firm renowned for aggressive crisis management and burying corporate scandals. The PR team had clearly prepped my abusers perfectly. Linda was dressed in a soft, unassuming pastel cardigan, her makeup expertly applied to make her look pale, frail, and exhausted. Thomas sat closely beside her, holding her hand with a manufactured expression of profound paternal sorrow. The bold graphic flashing across the bottom of the screen read, "Wealthy local family terrorized by elaborate extortion plot." I turned up the volume, my jaw clenching so hard, my teeth ached, as I listened to the absolute masterclass in gaslighting unfolding on live television. The news anchor leaned forward, feigning deep journalistic sympathy, and asked Linda to explain the horrific ordeal their family was currently enduring. Linda pressed a white tissue to the corner of her eye, squeezing out a perfectly timed, trembling tear. "We adopted Melanie when she was just a beautiful baby." Linda lied flawlessly directly into the camera lens. "We gave her a wonderful home, the best private education, and all the unconditional love in our hearts. But she was always a deeply troubled, rebellious child. She rejected our family values and completely cut ties with us years ago to live a very dark lifestyle." Thomas took over the narrative seamlessly, his voice a calculated, masterful mix of firmness and heartbreak. "We were entirely devastated when she left," he added, looking down at his hands. "But we continued to support our biological son, Garrett, who recently founded a highly successful technology company and was about to marry the absolute love of his life. Unfortunately, Melanie's lifelong jealousy over her brother's success became a dangerous obsession. She simply could not stand to see him happy and thriving while she struggled." The anchor gasped right on cue, prompting Linda to deliver the killing blow. She looked directly into the camera and spun a web of pure malicious fiction. Melanie has severe untreated psychological issues, Linda stated, shaking her head tragically. She recently showed up uninvited at Garrett's private wedding reception, screaming and making wild delusional claims. She presented completely forged DNA documents, falsely claiming she is the biological daughter of the bride's wealthy father. It was a calculated, sick attempt to extort money from our family and destroy Garrett's beautiful marriage out of pure, unadulterated spite. They painted me as a deranged, jealous sibling, staging an elaborate criminal con to steal a billionaire's fortune. It was a sickening, perfectly executed smear campaign designed to destroy my professional credibility before my forensic audit could destroy their freedom. They knew they could not win in a courtroom where hard evidence and encrypted ledgers reigned supreme, so they were attempting to win in the court of public opinion. They wanted to brand me as a delusional extortionist, so that when I finally handed their financial crimes over to federal authorities, it would look like the desperate, fabricated revenge of a disturbed woman. I turned off the broadcast, throwing my phone onto the mattress. I quickly dressed in my sharpest, most intimidating power suit and drove straight to my firm. The atmosphere in my office building was incredibly tense. My employees were seasoned professionals, but the aggressive media blitz was already causing significant collateral damage. The phones were ringing relentlessly, and the callers were not looking to hire us for forensic accounting. By noon, the professional fallout hit with devastating, suffocating force. My operations manager walked into my private office, her face pale and drawn. She closed the heavy glass door quietly behind her and delivered the catastrophic news. Our two largest corporate clients had just pulled their contracts. These were massive, multi-year auditing accounts that formed the financial backbone of my entire agency. I immediately called the chief financial officer of the first company, a man I had worked with closely and successfully for 3 years. He sounded genuinely apologetic, but entirely resolute. "Melanie, you are brilliant at what you do," he explained over the phone, his tone heavy with regret. "But this public drama is highly explosive. My board of directors is panicking. We are a publicly traded company, and we simply cannot have our lead external auditor embroiled in a bizarre tabloid scandal involving forged DNA, extortion lawsuits, and ruined billionaire weddings. The reputational risk to our own brand is just too high right now." The second corporate client gave almost the exact same excuse. Thomas and Linda's sleazy public relations strategy was working exactly as intended. They were effectively suffocating my business, isolating me professionally, and attempting to strip away my capital so I would be forced to drop the discovery lawsuit. I spent the rest of the afternoon doing aggressive damage control. I called an emergency all-hands meeting with my staff. I stood at the head of the long conference table and looked at the brilliant analysts, investigators, and software engineers I had hired. I did not sugarcoat the situation. I told them the absolute truth. I explained that the family who raised me was currently engaged in a massive coordinated media attack because my ongoing audit was about to expose them for kidnapping, severe financial fraud, and running a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. I assured my team that the firm had enough liquid capital in our backup credit union accounts to cover payroll and operational expenses for the next 6 months, regardless of the dropped corporate contracts. I offered anyone who felt uncomfortable the option to walk away right then with a generous severance package. Not a single person stood up to leave. Instead, my lead data engineer cracked his knuckles, opened his laptop, and asked which offshore account I wanted him to rip open next. We were going to war. While my team doubled down on stabilizing our remaining client base, I locked myself in my private office to monitor the continuing media circus. Garrett had now taken to his social media platforms, weaponizing his tech bro following. He posted a lengthy, tearful video portraying himself as the devastated victim of a toxic, unhinged sister. He claimed my fake DNA stunt had completely traumatized his new bride, causing her to flee the state in severe emotional distress. He deliberately omitted the fact that his bride had actually fled because she watched a live security feed of him having a violent, destructive tantrum in my server room, realizing he was a complete fraud who only wanted her father's real estate money. Garrett's followers flooded my business pages with negative reviews, tanking my firm's online rating within hours. The public pressure was suffocating, a heavy, dark cloud designed to crush my spirit and force a surrender. But they did not understand how a forensic accountant's mind works. Every lie they told on television, every fake tear Linda shed, and every arrogant post Garrett made only fueled my intense, icy focus. They were fighting with smoke and mirrors. I was fighting with hard, undeniable mathematics. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about public relations firms or daytime television interviews. I stayed in my office long after the sun went down, the city lights illuminating the dark room as I stared at my array of monitors. My employees had gone home, leaving me alone with the quiet, steady hum of the servers. I was nursing my fourth cup of black coffee, watching my business reputation take a severe, unjust hit on the news channels playing silently on a side screen. I turned my attention back to the custom decryption software running on my primary monitor. Earlier in the week, my algorithms had breached the outer layers of Thomas's banking history, exposing his embezzlement from elderly clients and the fraudulent shell companies keeping Garrett's startup afloat. But there was one specific, heavily fortified digital vault located in an obsolete banking server in the Cayman Islands that had resisted all my initial brute force hacking attempts. It was Thomas's oldest, most deeply buried offshore account created over 3 decades ago. My software had been silently grinding against its complex encryption keys for 48 hours straight. Suddenly, a sharp, crystalline chime echoed from my computer speakers. The green progress bar on my screen hit 100%. The digital lock fractured, and the decryption software finally cracked the ancient offshore ledger wide open. The firewall dissolved, granting me full, unhindered access to the absolute foundation of Thomas's financial empire. I leaned forward, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as the raw transaction data flooded the screen. I scrolled to the very bottom of the ledger, hunting for the genesis of his wealth. I found the very first deposit dated exactly 32 years ago, just weeks after my biological mother's baby had vanished from that Chicago hospital. I stared at the glowing screen, the breath completely leaving my lungs. The numbers I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a massive lump sum wire transfer originating from a heavily redacted corporate holding account. But with my unrestricted access, I easily bypassed the redaction. The source of the money was a private emergency fund controlled by the Thorne family estate. The exact amount transferred into Thomas's secret account was $3 million. It was not a business loan. It was not an early real estate investment. It was the exact to the penny amount of the ransom money paid out by my grieving, desperate biological family during my original kidnapping. Thomas and Linda had not just stolen me to be a free caregiver. They had extorted my biological mother for $3 million, faked my disappearance, and then used my own family's ransom money to fund Thomas's entire banking career. The sheer, unfathomable evil of it paralyzed me. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling with a lethal, world-ending rage, and dialed Jonathan Thorne. Jonathan answered on the first ring. His voice was sharp and alert, despite the late hour, demanding to know what I had found in the dark corners of the financial servers. I stared at the glowing digits on my monitor, my voice remarkably calm as I explained the exact origin of Thomas and his banking career. I told him about the $3 million wire transfer from 32 years ago. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Jonathan confirmed my worst fears in a hollow, devastated whisper. The Thorne family estate had indeed paid a massive ransom decades ago. They had received an anonymous demand shortly after I was taken from the maternity ward. Desperate to get Eleanor's baby back, Jonathan's father had authorized the payment, dropping the untraceable funds exactly as instructed. But the kidnappers never returned the child. They took the money and vanished into thin air, leaving Eleanor to die of a broken heart. Thomas and Linda had extorted my grieving family to build their perfect suburban life. Jonathan was furious, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise of vengeance. He wanted to send his private security contractors to their house right that second. But I stopped him. I reminded Jonathan that Thomas was incredibly arrogant, but he was not legally stupid. The statute of limitations for the extortion and the kidnapping had expired. We could not put them in federal prison for crimes committed 3 decades ago. If we wanted to see them behind bars for the rest of their natural lives, we needed to nail them for the crimes they were committing right now today. I told Jonathan to stay on the line and listen as I dug deeper into their current financial architecture. I left the phone on speaker and pivoted my chair to the adjacent monitors. The $3 million ransom was the foundation of their wealth. But 30 years of maintaining a luxurious lifestyle and funding a golden child would have drained that initial seed money long ago. They needed a constant, massive influx of cash to sustain their current image. I targeted Garrett first. His technology startup was the pride and joy of the family, constantly featured in business magazines and lauded as a revolutionary force in artificial intelligence. Thomas and Linda had used Garrett's supposed genius as a weapon against me for years, mocking my accounting firm while praising his visionary coding skills. I breached the operational ledgers of Garrett's company with ease. The internal security was laughably weak, reflecting the incompetence of its founder. I bypassed the superficial financial statements they provided to the public and dug directly into the raw developer repositories and the actual banking routing numbers. It took me less than 40 minutes to dismantle the entire illusion. I isolated the intellectual property folders, searching for the revolutionary artificial intelligence code that was supposedly driving their massive valuation. The folders were completely empty. There was no proprietary algorithm. There was no machine learning software. Garrett had hired a few freelance developers to build a flashy user interface that did absolutely nothing. The entire technology product was a fabricated front, a shiny digital facade hiding a massive financial black hole. I pulled up the investor capital ledgers, and the true nature of his business became sickeningly clear. Garrett was operating a textbook, highly aggressive Ponzi scheme. I traced the massive influx of cash coming from new wealthy private investors. Garrett was not using that capital for research and development. He was taking the new investor money and immediately funneling it to his early backers, classifying the payments as massive technological profit dividends. He was creating the illusion of explosive corporate growth to lure in even bigger fish. But the most disgusting part of the ledger was the executive compensation structure. Garrett was siphoning millions of dollars directly from the incoming investment capital into hidden personal accounts. I tracked the outbound wires. He was using stolen investor funds to pay for his custom-tailored suits, his fleet of imported sports cars, his luxury vacations to the Maldives, and the massive diamond ring he used to propose to Jonathan's daughter. My golden child brother was not a tech genius. He was a common, reckless thief, running a fragile criminal enterprise that was mathematically guaranteed to collapse within weeks. I relayed every detail to Jonathan over the speakerphone. I could hear his rapid keystrokes on the other end as he likely initiated quiet moves to block Garrett from any further contact with his daughter or his personal network. But a lingering question bothered me. A Ponzi scheme requires constant momentum. There are always lean months where new investor capital slows down. If Garrett did not have fresh money to pay off the old investors, the illusion would shatter instantly. He needed a reliable, silent backer to plug the holes and keep the scheme afloat during dry spells. I turned my attention to the man who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I opened the decrypted offshore files containing Thomas and his modern banking transactions. Thomas was a senior executive at a highly respected commercial bank entrusted with managing the wealth of thousands of clients. I ran a comparative analysis cross-referencing the dates of Garrett's lowest cash flow months with Thomas's internal banking access logs. The correlation was instantaneous and horrifying. Thomas was not just protecting his son's fraudulent company, he was actively financing it with stolen money. I tracked the specific accounts Thomas had flagged for personal oversight at his bank. They belonged exclusively to elderly clients, specifically individuals suffering from severe cognitive decline, or seniors who had no living next of kin to monitor their estates. Thomas was preying on the most vulnerable people in the financial system. I watched the digital trail of his embezzlement unfold across my screens. He would manipulate the quarterly statements of these elderly clients, skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time. He routed the stolen funds through a complex maze of shell companies registered in the Caribbean, washing the money clean before injecting it directly into Garrett's failing startup disguised as anonymous venture capital. The scope of their depravity was breathtaking. Thomas and Linda had kidnapped me and extorted my biological family for seed money. Then they used that blood money to build a platform of power, which Thomas now used to systematically rob vulnerable senior citizens just to fund the lavish, fraudulent lifestyle of his biological son. The entire family empire was a house of cards, built on kidnapping, extortion, elder abuse, and massive federal wire fraud. "We have them," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet office. I spoke directly into the phone, my eyes locked on the undeniable proof of their active, ongoing felonies. The statute of limitations on these wire fraud and embezzlement charges is wide open. Thomas has stolen over $14 million from elderly banking clients in the last 5 years alone. Garrett has defrauded private investors out of $20 million. We do not need to prosecute them for what they did 32 years ago. The federal government will gladly put them in prison for the rest of their lives for what they did last Tuesday. Jonathan's voice was a low, resonant growl of absolute triumph. "Get everything, Melanie. Download every single ledger, every routed IP address, and every fake investor dividend. Secure the data and get out of that building. I am sending my private security detail to escort you to my estate. We are taking this directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the morning." I did not need to be told twice. I initiated a mass download transferring the massive cache of smoking gun files onto a high-capacity military-grade encrypted external hard drive. A progress bar appeared in the center of my main monitor, glowing a bright, steady blue in the dark room. 10%. 20%. The sheer volume of the financial data meant the transfer would take several tense minutes. I sat back in my leather chair, my eyes glued to the screen, watching the digital evidence of their destruction slowly compile into a single undeniable weapon. 50%, 60%. The silence of the empty office building was absolute, amplifying the steady rhythmic hum of my computer servers. I felt a profound sense of vindication washing over me. I was no longer the unwanted, unpaid servant scrubbing stains on a kitchen floor. I was the architect of their total downfall. 80%, 90%. Suddenly, the tranquil silence of the night was violently shattered. A shrill, deafening mechanical shriek erupted from the ceiling speakers. The building's emergency security alarms began blaring with a terrifying, ear-splitting intensity. Flashing red strobe lights pulsed aggressively in the hallway outside my frosted glass office door, casting harsh, bloody shadows across my desk. My heart slammed against my ribs. I jumped out of my chair, my eyes darting toward the secondary monitor dedicated to the building's internal security camera feeds. Someone had not just swiped a badge incorrectly. Someone had violently breached the ground floor lobby. I maximized the security feed for the main entrance. The heavy glass front doors of my firm had been completely shattered. Standing in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by broken glass and pulsing red light, was a figure dressed in a dark hooded sweatshirt. The intruder reached up and pulled the hood back, staring directly into the security camera with an expression of cornered, unhinged desperation. It was Garrett. He was holding a heavy steel crowbar in his right hand, his knuckles white with tension. He had realized that the frozen credit lines did not stop my audit. He knew his fraudulent empire was currently being dismantled on my servers, and he had come to physically destroy the evidence before I could hand it over to the authorities. The progress bar on my download hit 98%. I watched the security feed as Garrett sprinted past the ruined lobby doors and headed straight for the stairwell, the heavy steel crowbar swinging wildly at his side. He was coming up to my floor. He was coming for the servers, and he was coming for me. The progress bar on my primary monitor ticked from 98 to 99%. The heavy rhythmic thud of Garrett ascending the emergency stairwell echoed through the silent building. He was not trying to be stealthy. He was moving with the sloppy, chaotic energy of a man whose entire fabricated reality was collapsing. 100%. The download completion chime rang out perfectly masked by the blaring security sirens. I immediately yanked the encrypted hard drive from the port, slipped it into the inner pocket of my blazer, and zipped it securely. The evidence was safe. Now I just had to handle the intruder. I stepped out of my private office and moved silently down the corridor toward the main server room. Forensic accounting firms require military-grade physical security to protect highly sensitive client data. Our server room was a reinforced concrete vault located at the center of the floor, equipped with titanium core doors and shatterproof glass viewing panels. I walked inside, the cooling hum of the server racks surrounding me, and deliberately left the heavy main door propped wide open. I pulled up a dummy diagnostic screen on the central terminal, making it look like an active vulnerable data transfer was still in progress. The stairwell door at the end of the hallway crashed open. Garrett stumbled onto the floor, his chest heaving as he gripped a heavy steel crowbar. He looked wildly down the corridor, his eyes locking onto the bright glowing screens of the server room. He let out a primal, enraged yell and sprinted directly toward me. I stood completely still next to the central terminal. I did not cower. I did not search for a weapon. I simply watched him charge into the server room like a cornered animal. He crossed the threshold, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he brandished the crowbar. "Shut it down!" Garrett screamed, pointing the heavy steel bar directly at my face. "Shut down the audit right now, Melanie, or I swear I will smash every single piece of hardware in this entire building." He did not wait for my response. He swung the crowbar wildly, bringing it down hard on a peripheral monitor sitting on a nearby desk. The plastic casing shattered, sending sparks and shards of dark glass flying across the anti-static floor. He swung again, denting a metal filing cabinet, breathing heavily as he tried to intimidate me with sheer physical destruction. I looked at the broken monitor, then back at my brother. "You are making a terrible mess," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any fear. "And you are trespassing on commercial property. The police are already on their way." "I do not care about the police!" he snarled, taking a threatening step closer. He pointed the crowbar at the dummy terminal glowing behind me. "You are not going to ruin my life. My company is about to be acquired. I am about to have access to the Thorne family billions. I earned that money. I played the game perfectly until you showed up with your fake DNA test and your jealous vendetta." I crossed my arms over my chest, studying his panicked, sweating face. "You did not earn anything, Garrett," I corrected him calmly. "Your artificial intelligence code is entirely non-existent. You are running a massive Ponzi scheme funded by the retirement accounts our father stole from vulnerable senior citizens. You are a fraud, and the Thorne family is never going to let you touch a single dime of their fortune." He let out a sharp, bitter laugh, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "They do not know anything about my company back-end code." He sneered, his arrogance momentarily overriding his panic. "My beautiful, naive wife thinks I am a tech genius. All I need is to keep her happy for 6 more months until her trust fund unlocks. Then I can pay off my early investors, dissolve the startup, and live like a king in Monaco. But I cannot do that if you send those files to the federal authorities. So turn off the servers right now, Melanie." He raised the crowbar again, preparing to smash the central terminal where he believed the incriminating data was currently being processed. I took a slow, calculated step backward, moving smoothly away from the dummy terminal and drifting toward the open doorway of the server room. Garrett was so fixated on the glowing screens and his own arrogant monologue that he did not even track my movements. He thought he was in total control. He thought physical intimidation was enough to dominate a woman who dismantled financial criminals for a living. "You are incredibly predictable, Garrett," I said softly. I stepped backward across the threshold, my heels planting firmly on the hallway carpet. Before Garrett could register that I was no longer inside the room with him, I reached out and slammed my palm against the emergency lockdown panel mounted on the exterior wall. The building internal defense protocols engaged instantly. The heavy titanium core door swung shut with a sudden violent force. It slammed into the reinforced frame with a massive echoing thud. The magnetic locks engaged sequentially, a series of heavy metallic clicks that permanently sealed the vault. Garrett spun around. his eyes widening in absolute shock. He dropped the crowbar and lunged at the door, grabbing the handle and pulling with all his might. It did not budge a single millimeter. He was completely and inescapably trapped inside the reinforced soundproof box. I stood safely in the hallway looking at him through the thick, shatterproof glass viewing panel built into the center of the door. The soundproofing was military grade, so his voice was completely muffled, but I could read the frantic, terrified movements of his lips. He was screaming at me to open the door. He slammed his fists against the glass, his face contorted in a mask of pure panic. When hitting the glass with his bare hands did not work, he retrieved the heavy steel crowbar. He backed up and swung it directly at the viewing panel with every ounce of strength he possessed. The steel bar struck the reinforced glass with a dull, heavy thud. It did not even leave a scratch. Forensic accounting firms build server rooms to withstand massive natural disasters and armed corporate espionage. A spoiled, desperate tech bro in a designer tracksuit was not going to break through. I watched him lose his mind for a moment, smashing the crowbar against the indestructible door over and over again, his face turning an angry mottled purple. Then I turned my attention away from his pathetic tantrum. I walked over to a secure secondary terminal mounted on the wall further down the hallway. I quickly typed in my administrative credentials and pulled up the firm internal communication software. The server room was equipped with multiple high-definition audio-enabled security cameras designed to monitor the hardware and record any unauthorized access. I opened a secure, encrypted video conferencing link. I had already established the connection parameters earlier in the evening when I first spoke to Jonathan Thorne. I hit the call button. The connection stabilized almost instantly, bridging my secure network with the private network at the Thorne family estate. The video feed popped up on my secondary monitor. Sitting in a luxurious, dimly lit study was Jonathan Thorne. Sitting directly beside him, her face pale and her eyes wide with apprehension, was his daughter, Garrett, brand new bride. She was still wearing a comfortable silk robe, having been woken up in the middle of the night by her father to witness the truth about the man she had just married. Melanie Jonathan's voice came through the terminal speakers, strong and focused. "We are here. We are watching. Do you have the evidence secured? I have the decrypted files safely downloaded and physically secured on my person." I confirmed, keeping my voice professional and steady. "But before I hand the financial ledgers over to the federal authorities in the morning, I thought it was crucial for your daughter to see exactly who she married." I tapped a few keys on the terminal, seamlessly routing the live security camera feeds from inside the server room directly into the video conference call. I unmuted the audio feed from inside the vault. Instantly, the quiet study on the other end of the line was filled with the sounds of Garrett's unhinged violence. Through the high-definition cameras, Jonathan and his daughter had a perfect multi-angle view of the man they thought was a charming, brilliant tech innovator. Instead, they saw a furious, deranged criminal. Garrett was screaming obscenities, completely unaware that his voice was being broadcast in crisp, clear audio to his new wife. He was smashing the crowbar into the empty server racks, kicking over chairs, and shouting about how he was going to destroy me for ruining his access to the Thorne family trust fund. "I am going to kill her!" Garrett screamed, pacing around the server room like a rabid animal swinging the crowbar at the ceiling panels. I just needed her to stay quiet for 6 months. I just needed that stupid girl inheritance to pay off the investors. She ruined my entire payout. I married that clueless idiot for nothing. I watched the video conference screen closely. Jonathan's jaw tightened into a rigid line of absolute lethal fury. He wrapped a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders. The young bride sat completely frozen, her eyes glued to the screen as she watched her new husband violently dismantle servers while screaming about how he had targeted her exclusively for her wealth. The illusion of her perfect romance shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of her eyes. Her expression shifted from shock to devastation, and then finally to a profound, icy anger. I tapped the intercom button that connected my hallway terminal to the speakers inside the locked server room. My voice cut through Garrett's screaming, echoing from the ceiling above him. "Garrett," I said smoothly, my voice crystal clear, "I think you should put the crowbar down. You are making a terrible impression on your wife, and she is watching you live right now." Garrett froze mid-swing. He dropped the crowbar, his eyes darting wildly toward the security cameras mounted in the corners of the room. The blood drained completely from his face as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was trapped in a reinforced vault, his financial crimes were fully downloaded, and his billionaire bride had just heard his entire disgusting confession. Garrett stood paralyzed, staring directly into the lens of the security camera mounted in the corner of the server room. The heavy steel crowbar slipped entirely from his slick, sweating fingers and clattered loudly onto the anti-static floor. Through the audio feed, I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a woman crying, but it was not the weeping of a broken heart. It was the sharp, hyperventilating gasp of absolute furious betrayal. On my secondary monitor, Jonathan Thorne leaned forward, moving closer to the microphone on his heavy mahogany desk. His voice resonated with the chilling absolute authority of a man accustomed to destroying corporate empires with a single command. "You will never speak to my daughter again," Jonathan stated, the audio piping cleanly into the server room speakers. "You will never approach my family, my properties, or my businesses. My private security team has already been dispatched to ensure you do not come within 100 miles of her. You are a pathetic, greedy fraud, and you have just made the biggest mistake of your incredibly short, miserable life." The bride, her face tear-streaked, but rapidly hardening into a mask of pure aristocratic vengeance, stepped fully into the frame. She stared at the man she had married just days prior, looking at him as if he were a disgusting insect she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "You are nothing but a common thief," she told Garrett, her voice trembling with a terrifying rage. "You thought you could use me as a bank account to fund your pathetic little startup. You are going to wish you had never met me." She reached forward and abruptly severed the connection. The video conference screen on my monitor went completely black. Garrett collapsed to his knees among the shattered plastic of the monitors he had destroyed, burying his face in his hands. He let out a loud, pathetic wail of defeat, but he did not have long to wallow in his own miserable failure. The flashing red strobe lights in the hallway were suddenly joined by the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots rushing up the emergency stairwell. Building security, closely followed by 4 squad cars worth of local police officers, swarmed the floor. I calmly unlocked the server room door from my administrative terminal and stepped aside as uniformed officers rushed in. They forcefully pulled a sobbing, defeated Garrett to his feet, wrenched his arms behind his back, and locked him in heavy steel handcuffs. I watched with deep, quiet satisfaction as my golden child brother was frog-marched out of my office building, his designer tracksuit covered in server room dust, facing felony charges for breaking and entering. The swiftness of the Thorne family's retaliation the next morning was a masterclass in corporate and legal warfare. Before the sun had even fully risen over the city, Jonathan's elite legal team filed emergency annulment papers in the state superior court. They bypassed standard lengthy divorce proceedings, entirely citing egregious premeditated fraud as the foundational basis of the marriage. Because they possessed the pristine audio and video recordings of Garrett explicitly admitting he only married her to siphon her trust fund to pay off his illegal investors. The presiding judge fast-tracked the annulment without a single moment of hesitation. Garrett's marriage to a billionaire heiress was officially erased from existence before he even finished processing his fingerprints at the downtown police precinct. But the annulment was merely the legal formality. The bride wanted immediate punitive financial revenge, and she executed it flawlessly. During their brief, heavily publicized engagement and whirlwind wedding planning, Garrett had convinced her to merge a portion of their operational finances. He had set up a series of joint marital accounts at his father's commercial bank, greedily preparing the digital architecture to catch the massive influx of cash from her trust fund the moment it unlocked. That greedy, calculated maneuver became his absolute undoing. Armed with her legal standing as a joint account holder, and backed by her father's terrifying legal muscle, the bride logged into the banking portal at 6 in the morning. She did not just withdraw her own assets. She reported the accounts for severe coordinated fraudulent activity, triggering an automatic irreversible security freeze on every single digital asset connected to Garrett's name. She locked down his personal checking accounts, his digital investment portfolios, and most devastatingly, the primary operational payroll accounts for his technology startup. With a few swift clicks of a mouse, she severed his financial arteries. She left him with absolutely zero liquidity. Garrett spent the entire night shivering in a crowded holding cell, surrounded by petty criminals, completely cut off from the affluent world he believed he ruled. He was formally charged with felony breaking and entering malicious destruction of commercial property and trespassing. It was not until late the following afternoon that Thomas finally managed to leverage enough cash to post his exorbitant bail. The car ride from the downtown precinct to the sprawling suburban house was suffocatingly silent. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were stark white, his jaw clenched in a permanent furious scowl. Garrett sat in the passenger seat, aggressively tapping his phone screen, desperately trying to figure out why his banking applications were returning massive red error codes. The moment they walked through the splintered, hastily repaired front door of their home, the reality of the crisis hit them with the force of a freight train. Linda was pacing the formal living room, clutching a crystal glass of white wine. The remnants of their sleazy public relations campaign played silently on the muted television in the background, but the dynamic had already shifted. The smear campaign against me was no longer holding the public's attention. Instead, local business blogs and tech forums were already buzzing with explosive rumors about Garrett's sudden humiliating arrest and the whispered rapid annulment of the society wedding of the decade. Their carefully manufactured public image was crumbling in real time, replaced by the ugly, undeniable truth of their criminality. "My cards are declining." Garrett panicked, pacing across the expensive Persian rug. He held his phone up his hands, shaking violently. "Every single card is dead. The joint accounts are completely locked. I tried to transfer emergency funds from the startup's reserve ledger to cover the legal fees for the arrest, but the system says the routing numbers are frozen, pending a massive fraud investigation." Thomas dropped his leather briefcase onto the glass dining table, running a trembling hand over his pale, sweating face. "The thorns." Thomas deduced instantly, his voice a hollow, defeated rasp. "They triggered a security freeze. They used the joint accounts to flag your entire financial portfolio. They trapped you." "It is worse than that," Garrett screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated hysteria. "Payday is tomorrow morning. I have 40 freelance developers and aggressive early-stage investors expecting their quarterly dividend payouts by noon on Friday. The accounts are locked. If those payments bounce, the investors are going to demand a full independent audit of the source code immediately. They are going to realize there is no artificial intelligence algorithm. The entire company is going to implode by the end of the week, and they are going to call the federal authorities." Linda dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spilling pale liquid across the expensive wood, but she did not even flinch. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, looking frantically between her husband and her golden child. "Thomas, you told me the tech company was fine. You told me you were expertly managing the startup's capital and that Garrett was a genius." "It is a Ponzi scheme." Linda Thomas finally admitted the sheer exhaustion of maintaining the lie, collapsing his immaculate posture. "It has always been a Ponzi scheme. Garrett built absolutely nothing. I have been secretly funneling money from my elderly banking clients into his company for 2 years, just to keep the early investors from calling the police and demanding their capital back. But I cannot transfer another dime without triggering federal red flags, not with Melanie currently holding my offshore ledgers hostage and scanning my routing numbers." The room fell into a dead, horrifying silence. The gravity of the situation settled over the three of them like a suffocating lead blanket. The walls were rapidly closing in. Garrett was facing immediate public exposure for a $20 million corporate fraud. Thomas was facing decades in federal prison for embezzling millions from vulnerable senior citizens. They had no access to the Thorne family billions. They had no operational liquidity to fake their success for even one more day. The angry wealthy investors were going to start calling the Securities and Exchange Commission the minute their Friday dividend checks bounced. They needed a massive immediate influx of cash completely untraceable and liquid to pay off the loudest investors, silence the developers, and buy themselves enough time to pack their bags and flee the country. They needed millions of dollars right this second to prevent the federal government from freezing their passports. They were completely and utterly out of options, cornered by their own bottomless greed. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a masterclass in high society deception. Thomas, Linda, and Garrett had spared absolutely no expense to maintain their crumbling facade, utilizing what I knew for a fact was the very last of their hidden offshore reserves. Towering floral arrangements of white orchids and imported lilies dominated the center of every silk-draped table. 3 massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the city's most affluent investors, socialites, and local media representatives. Waiters in crisp black vests and white gloves circulated seamlessly through the crowd, offering silver trays loaded with caviar blinis and vintage champagne. It was an extravagant, desperate illusion. They were throwing a lavish victory gala to celebrate a $20 million corporate buyout that simply did not exist. It was a frantic final gamble to convince their remaining increasingly suspicious investors that Garrett's hollow tech startup was a triumphant empire, hoping the fake buyout announcement would buy them enough time to pack their bags and flee the country. I stood just outside the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, listening to the muffled sounds of their celebration. For 23 years, I had been the unpaid help, the scapegoat forced to clean up their messes, while they paraded around in unearned luxury. They had built this entire glittering world using the $3 million ransom money they extorted from my grieving biological family. Tonight, that world was going to burn to the ground. Inside, Thomas tapped his crystal flute with a silver spoon, bringing the crowded ballroom to an immediate respectful hush. The sharp, clear ringing sound echoed through the heavy wooden doors. He adjusted his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket and leaned confidently over the sleek acrylic podium. Garrett stood to his immediate right, wearing a smug, artificially whitened smile, posing perfectly for the local press cameras. Linda stood to his left, draped in an incredibly expensive pearl-colored silk gown, playing the role of the devoted, flawless matriarch to absolute perfection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas boomed his deep, practiced banking voice projecting flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are gathered here tonight not merely to celebrate a monumental $20 million business transaction. We are here to celebrate the very essence of the American dream. When my brilliant son Garrett first came to me with his visionary artificial intelligence platform, I knew instantly that I was looking at the absolute future of global technology. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. The investors in the crowd applauded completely unaware that their capital had already been siphoned into Garrett's luxury car collection and Thomas's overseas accounts. "We built this family legacy on a foundation of absolute integrity, relentless hard work, and unconditional loyalty," Thomas proclaimed, pausing to let his commanding gaze sweep across the captivated, wealthy audience. But as we all know, massive success is never easily achieved, and unfortunately, extraordinary success frequently attracts the bitter envy of those who simply lack the vision and the drive to build something themselves. We all know that there are certain people in this world who are handed every conceivable advantage. People who are given a warm, loving home, a pristine education, and endless opportunities, yet they still choose the dark path of resentment. They attempt to tear down the magnificent achievements of their superiors out of pure, unadulterated jealousy and spite. The ballroom erupted into polite, supportive applause. Garrett smirked, raising his champagne glass in a mock toast to his invisible haters. Linda delicately wiped a fake performative tear from the corner of her eye, nodding solemnly at her husband's profound words. They were publicly branding me as a jealous, bitter detractor, setting the stage to dismiss the inevitable fallout of my forensic audit as a pathetic revenge plot. But tonight proves that undeniable truth and genuine innovation will always prevail over malicious petty detractors, Thomas announced, raising his voice over the swelling applause. We stood strong and united as a family. Linda, my beautiful and resilient wife, provided the unwavering maternal support that allowed Garrett's genius to truly flourish. And Garrett, my son, you have proven yourself to be a true titan of the modern industry. To the future. As the crowd raised their crystal glasses and the applause reached a deafening crescendo, the carefully curated atmosphere in the ballroom violently shifted. The upbeat ambient instrumental music, playing softly through the overhead speakers, abruptly cut off, replaced by a harsh, ear-splitting burst of static that made several guests wince and cover their ears. The massive high-definition projector screens flanking the main stage, which had been proudly displaying Garrett's fake corporate logos in vibrant colors, suddenly glitched. The images scrambled into chaotic, distorted pixels before the screen snapped to a solid, blindingly harsh black. A collective gasp rippled through the affluent crowd. Thomas frowned deeply, tapping the microphone, assuming it was a simple, irritating technical malfunction. He signaled frantically to the audiovisual technicians stationed at the back of the room, snapping his fingers aggressively to demand their attention. But the technicians were no longer sitting at their control boards. They were standing perfectly still against the back wall, their hands raised slightly in the air, stepping entirely away from their equipment. Before Thomas could demand an explanation, the heavy gilded double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a deafening, thunderous crash. The sheer force of the impact rattled the heavy brass hinges and echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. The sea of wealthy guests parted instinctively, whispering in sudden alarm as a wide, unobstructed path cleared straight down the center aisle. I stepped over the threshold, the thick, luxurious carpet silencing my footsteps, but the absolute commanding authority in my posture demanding every single ounce of attention in the massive room. I was no longer the broken, humiliated girl wearing a cheap water-stained catering dress, scrubbing wine stains off a floor while being verbally abused. I was dressed in a razor-sharp, impeccably tailored midnight blue suit. My head was held high, my shoulders squared back, and my eyes were locked directly onto the pale, sweating face of the man who had stolen my entire life. Flanking me on my right was Jonathan Thorne. The billionaire real estate mogul did not look like a grieving uncle tonight. He radiated a terrifying, lethal calm. He looked like an apex predator who had finally cornered his prey, stepping into the light to exact 32 years' worth of vengeance. Flanking me on my left, and rapidly pouring into the ballroom in a highly coordinated tactical formation, were a dozen federal agents. The bold, bright yellow letters spelling FBI across the back of their dark navy windbreakers stood out in stark, terrifying contrast to the sea of designer gowns and expensive tuxedos. The distinct heavy sound of their tactical boots hitting the floor sent a wave of genuine panic through the high society crowd. The entire ballroom descended into an absolute suffocating silence. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased completely. The quiet murmurs of the confused socialites evaporated into thin air. Wealthy investors shrank back desperately, trying to distance themselves from whatever crime was about to be exposed. The only sound remaining in the vast space was the rhythmic, deliberate, unhurried click of my heels as I walked straight down the center aisle. I watched the arrogant color drain completely and utterly from Linda's face. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I owed her for taking me in now looked like a cornered animal. Her manicured hand trembled so violently that her delicate champagne flute slipped from her frozen grasp. It shattered violently against the polished wooden stage floor, sending shards of crystal flying across the stage. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking glass echoed through the silent room, but absolutely nobody looked away from me. Garrett literally took a stumbling step backward, attempting to physically hide behind his father's broad shoulder. His arrogant, practiced smirk was instantly obliterated, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated, wide-eyed terror. He looked wildly around the room, realizing that his fake billionaire bride was not coming to save him, and that his fraudulent tech empire was collapsing in real time under the weight of federal scrutiny. Thomas gripped the outer edges of the clear acrylic podium, his knuckles turning stark bone white. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to speak, trying to utilize his booming, authoritative banking voice to order the private hotel security to remove us. But the words completely died in his tight throat. He saw the federal badges flashing under the chandelier lights. He saw the severe, unsmiling faces of the armed agents swiftly fanning out to secure and lock down every single exit in the ballroom. He knew with absolute crushing certainty that the grand illusion was permanently over. I ascended the carpeted steps to the main stage with slow, deliberate, punishing precision. I did not rush the moment. I wanted them to feel the agonizing weight of every single second of their impending destruction. The local press photographers, possessing the sharp instinct to sense an explosive shift in the narrative, immediately pivoted their heavy camera lenses away from the fake golden child. They aimed them directly at me and the advancing federal agents. The blinding, rapid-fire flashes illuminated the sheer naked panic etched deeply across my abusers' faces, capturing the exact moment their high society facade crumbled into dust. I walked right up to Thomas. He was entirely paralyzed, his chest heaving as his breath came in shallow, ragged, terrified gasps. He smelled of expensive cologne and sour, cold sweat. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream, throw a tantrum, or lose my flawless composure. I simply reached out, firmly grasped the slender stem of the microphone he had just been using to lie to the world, and tapped it twice. The sharp, amplified thuds echoed through the massive, breathless ballroom, ensuring that every single investor, socialite, and reporter was hanging desperately on to my next words. "Good evening," I said, my voice echoing with icy perfection through the cavernous space. Thomas is absolutely correct about one thing. Extraordinary success does indeed attract attention. However, he left out a crucial detail. The attention this family has attracted tonight is not born of jealousy. It is born of a federal mandate. I did not wait for his sputtering protests. I gestured sharply to the lead FBI agent standing by the soundboard at the back of the room. The agent plugged a decrypted flash drive directly into the hotel's primary audiovisual system. The massive projector screens behind the stage instantly flared back to life, but they were no longer displaying the sleek, fabricated logos of Garrett's technology startup. Instead, a highly magnified, certified laboratory document filled the screens. The stark black text stood out like a death sentence against the bright white background. For 32 years, this man and woman claimed they generously adopted me out of the goodness of their hearts. I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, terrified silence of the ballroom. They demanded my endless gratitude. They treated me as an unpaid servant, forcing me to scrub their floors and clean up their biological son's constant messes. But the document you see on the screen behind them tells the actual truth. A low murmur of confusion rippled through the sea of wealthy investors and socialites. People squinted, reading the bold letters on the projected medical report. "I am not an unwanted, abandoned child." I continued, turning to look directly into Thomas's panicked, sweating face. "I am the biological niece of Jonathan Thorne. 32 years ago, Linda used her physical access keys as a maternity nurse at a private Chicago hospital to kidnap me from my mother's arms. Thomas and Linda did not just steal a child to use as free labor. They extorted my grieving family for a $3 million ransom, faked my disappearance, and then used my own family's blood money to fund Thomas's entire prestigious banking career." The collective gasp from the high society crowd was loud enough to rattle the crystal chandeliers. Several women covered their mouths in absolute horror. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, chaotic frenzy as local press photographers captured the undeniable certified DNA evidence projected on the screens. "This is a lie!" Thomas roared, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he gripped the acrylic podium. "She is a deranged, jealous extortionist. Security, remove this woman immediately. Shut off those screens." "Nobody is shutting anything off, Thomas." Jonathan Thorne spoke for the first time. His voice was a low, resonant growl of absolute lethal authority that paralyzed the room. "You stole my sister's child. You destroyed her life. And tonight, every single person in this city is going to watch you pay for it." The kidnapping is merely the prologue, I said, drawing the crowd's attention back to me. I clicked a small remote in my hand. The massive screens transitioned from the DNA results to a complex color-coded financial ledger. Red and green data streams cascaded down the displays, highlighting massive illegal offshore wire transfers. Many of you in this room believe you are here tonight to celebrate a $20 million corporate buyout of an artificial intelligence startup. I projected my voice clearly, ensuring every single investor heard the absolute truth. You believe you backed a visionary prodigy. You are mistaken. You are actually standing in the middle of a collapsing multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. Garrett let out a loud, pathetic whimper. He stumbled away from the podium, looking desperately toward the exit, but the line of stoic federal agents standing shoulder to shoulder blocking the doors quickly extinguished any hope of escape. There is no artificial intelligence algorithm, I stated, walking slowly across the stage, my eyes tracking the furious expressions of the wealthy venture capitalists in the front row. Garrett's entire company is a hollow digital facade. He has been taking your aggressive funding rounds and immediately siphoning millions of dollars into hidden personal accounts to buy imported sports cars and luxury vacations. But to keep a Ponzi scheme afloat during dry spells, you need a silent, corrupt backer with deep pockets. I clicked the remote again. The screens magnified a specific set of wire transfers, explicitly showing routing numbers connected directly to Thomas's commercial bank. Thomas used his senior executive position to systematically rob vulnerable elderly banking clients. I explained the cold mathematics of my forensic audit laid bare for the world to see. He washed their stolen retirement funds through shell companies in the Caribbean, then injected that stolen money directly into Garrett's failing startup disguised as anonymous venture capital. You were not investing in technology, you were funding their criminal lifestyle with stolen pension money. The ballroom exploded into pure, unadulterated outrage. Wealthy investors began shouting, their faces turning red with fury as they realized they had been conned by the very man standing on the stage preaching about family values. Several attendees pulled out their cell phones, frantically calling their financial advisors and wealth managers. "We just sold the company!" Garrett shrieked over the rising chaos, his voice high and thin with panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted in a mask of arrogant, desperate denial. "You are just too late, Melanie. We signed the $20 million acquisition paperwork this morning with an international holding company. The capital is already locked. We are rich, and you are just a pathetic, jealous loser making up spreadsheets." I stopped pacing. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. This was the exact moment I had engineered with ruthless mathematical precision. This was the absolute, inescapable checkmate. "I am so incredibly glad you brought up the corporate acquisition, Garrett," I said softly, but the microphone carried the deadly satisfaction in my tone to every corner of the room. I clicked the remote one final time. The massive projector screens displayed a high-definition scan of the official legally binding acquisition contract Thomas and Garrett had eagerly signed just 8 hours prior. The signatures of both men, along with Linda's signature as a primary corporate guarantor, were magnified in bold ink at the bottom of the document. "You were so desperate to cash out and flee the country before the Securities and Exchange Commission noticed your missing funds," I explained, looking directly at the sweating, crumbling men on the stage. "You were so blinded by your own bottomless greed that you failed to conduct even a basic background check on the international holding company offering to buy your worthless startup." I turned my back on them and looked out at the furious, captivated crowd. "The entity that purchased Garrett's company this morning is Vanguard Apex Holdings," I announced. "It is a private corporate trust. I am the sole owner, the primary shareholder, and the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex Holdings." Thomas physically staggered backward as if he had been shot. He collided heavily with the backdrop, his mouth hanging open in absolute paralyzed horror as the realization of his catastrophic mistake crashed down upon him. "When you signed those acquisition documents this morning, you legally guaranteed that your technology company was entirely free of financial fraud, hidden liabilities, and pending litigation," I explained, turning to face my abusers, letting them see the cold, brilliant calculation in my eyes. "You signed a binding, irrevocable breach of contract clause. You stipulated that if any systemic fraud was discovered post-acquisition, the holding company possessed the immediate legal right to seize all of the guarantor's personal assets as collateral to recoup the damages. Linda let out a loud, suffocating gasp, clutching her chest as her knees buckled slightly. Because your entire company is a confirmed, verifiable Ponzi scheme, you are currently in catastrophic breach of that contract, I stated, my voice echoing like a judge handing down a final sentence. I triggered the forfeiture clause exactly 3 minutes before walking through those ballroom doors. My attorneys have legally seized your multi-million-dollar suburban home. We have seized your luxury vehicles. We have locked down every single domestic and offshore bank account connected to your names. You do not have a single dime of operational liquidity left. You are instantly, legally, and permanently bankrupt. And the absolute devastation on their faces was profound. The arrogant banking executive and his golden child son were entirely stripped of their unearned wealth, humiliated in front of high society, and reduced to absolute nothingness by the woman they had kidnapped to use as a maid. They had nothing left to leverage, no money to hire defense attorneys, and no way to escape the federal hammer that was about to drop. Jonathan Thorne nodded sharply to the lead FBI agent. The federal agent swarmed the stage in a swift, highly coordinated tactical maneuver. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the microphone as an agent forcefully wrenched Thomas's arms behind his back. Another pair of agents tackled a sobbing, hyperventilating Garrett against the acrylic podium, securing his wrists tightly in steel cuffs. They read them their rights regarding massive federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and violations of the Securities Exchange Act. The flashbulbs of the press cameras went into a blinding frenzy, capturing the highly publicized, deeply humiliating downfall of the fraudulent empire. The investors cheered, watching the architects of the massive scam being frog-marched toward the exits. I stood calmly on the stage, watching the men who had tormented me finally face the brutal consequences of their arrogance. But in the corner of my eye, I caught a sudden, violent blur of movement. Linda watched her husband and her golden child being violently apprehended by federal authorities. She watched her stolen wealth evaporate into thin air. Her perfect, pristine, high society life was entirely destroyed, replaced by the terrifying reality of federal prison and absolute poverty. The carefully constructed, elegant facade of the suburban matriarch completely snapped. Her mind fractured under the weight of her total, inescapable ruin. She let out a guttural, inhuman screech of pure, unadulterated madness. "You ruined everything!" Linda shrieked, her voice tearing through her throat with unhinged, violent hysteria. "You were born to be a servant!" She lunged toward a nearby catering table draped in white linen. Her hands closed desperately around the thick, heavy neck of a full, unopened magnum of vintage champagne resting in a silver ice bucket. She ripped the heavy glass bottle from the ice, her eyes wide and completely manic. With a terrifying scream of pure hatred, she charged blindly across the stage, raising the heavy glass weapon high into the air and lunged violently directly at my head. The heavy magnum of vintage champagne descended in a deadly arc aimed squarely at my temple. Linda's face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She had lost her wealth, her status, and her golden child, and she was entirely willing to commit murder in front of 300 witnesses to exact her revenge. I did not flinch. I did not even raise my arms to protect myself. I simply watched the woman who had stolen my childhood throw away the very last shred of her own freedom. Before the thick glass could make contact, a massive wall of solid muscle intercepted the strike. Jonathan Thorne's lead security contractor, a former Special Forces operative who had been tracking Linda's erratic movements the entire evening, stepped seamlessly between us. He caught Linda's descending wrist with a vice-like grip, halting the heavy bottle mid-air with effortless, terrifying precision. With a swift, practiced tactical maneuver, he twisted her arm sharply downward. The heavy champagne bottle slipped from her manicured fingers and crashed onto the wooden stage, shattering into a spectacular spray of foam and green glass. In the very next second, the security contractor swept Linda's legs out from under her, driving her forcefully face down onto the polished floor. Linda shrieked, thrashing wildly against the unyielding weight of the operative pinning her down. The elegant pearl-colored silk gown she had specifically chosen to project high society grace was now soaked in spilled champagne and dusted with the shattered remains of her weapon. She looked completely feral. I looked out at the vast ballroom. The absolute disgust radiating from the affluent crowd was palpable. The wealthy socialites, the influential investors, and the elite country club members she had spent decades desperately trying to impress were staring at her with profound revulsion. Her carefully constructed facade of the refined, benevolent suburban matriarch was permanently obliterated. They saw exactly what she was, a violent, desperate criminal. Two female FBI agents swiftly moved onto the stage, pulling a thrashing Linda to her feet and wrenching her arms behind her back. The harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping around her wrists echoed clearly through the ballroom. She was read her rights for attempted aggravated assault with a deadly weapon right there on the stage, her high society peers capturing every humiliating second on their smartphones. I watched in absolute icy silence as the federal agents frog-marched my three abusers down the center aisle of the Plaza Hotel ballroom and out into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers. The nightmare was officially over. The legal fallout that followed was a magnificent, utterly devastating spectacle of federal justice. Thomas and Garrett were formally indicted on 74 counts of federal wire fraud, mass embezzlement, and violations of the Securities Exchange Act. The mountain of decrypted financial ledgers I handed over to the Department of Justice provided a flawless, irrefutable roadmap of their crimes. Facing the absolute certainty of decades in federal prison, their high-priced defense attorneys immediately attempted to negotiate a plea deal. The federal prosecutors, armed with my forensic evidence, flatly refused. But the most brilliant legal victory came regarding the kidnapping. Thomas had arrogantly believed that the 32-year statute of limitations shielded them from facing consequences for stealing me from the maternity ward. He was wrong. Jonathan Thorne's elite legal team worked directly with the federal prosecutors to execute a breathtaking legal maneuver. Because Thomas had continuously used the original $3 million ransom money to establish his offshore accounts, and because he was actively using the compounded interest from that specific blood money to fund Garrett's fraudulent startup, the kidnapping was legally classified as the originating predicate offense for an ongoing active federal money laundering conspiracy. By financially commingling the 32-year-old ransom money with his current embezzlement scheme, Thomas had kept the statute of limitations wide open. The federal judge approved the upgraded charges without a single moment of hesitation. They were not just going to prison for defrauding investors. They were going to federal penitentiaries for aggravated kidnapping and interstate extortion. The seizure of their assets was absolute and uncompromising. My holding company liquidated their sprawling suburban mansion, their luxury imported vehicles, and every single piece of expensive jewelry Linda had hoarded over the decades. We systematically stripped them of their unearned wealth and transferred every single recovered dollar into a restitution fund designed exclusively to repay the vulnerable elderly banking clients Thomas had robbed. They were left with absolutely nothing but their prison uniforms. With my abusers locked away behind concrete walls, I finally took the time to rebuild my own life. I legally changed my name, shedding the toxic identity forced upon me, and proudly reclaiming my true heritage as Melanie Thorne. The integration into my biological family was a profound, deeply healing experience. Jonathan proved to be fiercely protective, incredibly brilliant, and endlessly supportive. His daughter, having narrowly escaped Garrett's predatory marriage, became the sister I never had. We bonded over our shared trauma and our mutual desire to ensure no one else ever fell victim to such manipulative monsters. I did not abandon my career. I absorbed my highly successful forensic accounting firm entirely into the massive Thorne corporate empire. With Jonathan's limitless financial backing and global resources, I transformed my agency into a specialized elite corporate division explicitly dedicated to hunting down white-collar criminals, financial abusers, and corporate predators. I built a team of the most ruthless, brilliant financial investigators in the country. We specialized in ripping open impenetrable offshore accounts, and exposing the exact type of arrogant frauds Thomas and Garrett had pretended to be. I turned my trauma into an unstoppable weapon for financial justice. Exactly 1 year after the dramatic arrests at the Plaza Hotel, I walked through the heavy reinforced steel doors of the Federal Women's Penitentiary. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal power suit, my heels clicking with sharp, purposeful authority against the drab linoleum floor of the maximum security visiting room. I sat down in a hard plastic chair and waited. A few minutes later, the heavy metal door on the opposite side of the thick bulletproof glass viewing partition buzzed open. A prison guard escorted an inmate to the chair across from me. It took me a second to fully recognize the woman sitting on the other side of the glass. The immaculate pearl-wearing matriarch was entirely gone. Linda looked incredibly haggard and aged. Her heavily dyed blonde hair had grown out into a stark, brittle gray. Her skin, deprived of expensive spa treatments and luxury creams, was deeply lined and sallow. She wore a drab, oversized khaki prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on her diminishing frame. She looked utterly defeated, broken by a year of hard reality in a concrete cell. She picked up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver mounted on her side of the glass. I picked up mine. "Melanie," Linda rasped, her voice scratching through the receiver. It lacked all the arrogant venom and artificial sweetness she had weaponized for decades. She just sounded tired and hollow. "Why are you here? Did you come to gloat? Did you come to laugh at me?" I looked at the woman who had stolen me from my mother's arms. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no lingering resentment. I just felt a profound, impenetrable coldness. "I do not gloat, Linda," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional attachment. "And I certainly do not find anything about your pathetic existence funny. I am here purely on business. I am tying up the very last loose end of my past." She stared at me, her sunken eyes darting nervously across my face. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of high-quality parchment paper. I slid it smoothly through the narrow stainless steel transaction slot located at the bottom of the bulletproof glass partition. Linda looked down at the paper, then reached out with a trembling hand to pick it up. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the printed text. "What is this?" she whispered, confusion masking her tired features. "It is a fully itemized, legally binding invoice," I explained, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms over my chest. "When you filed that frivolous, arrogant civil lawsuit against me, you explicitly demanded $1.5 million in compensation for the basic food and shelter you provided me. You attempted to charge me for existing in your house." Linda swallowed hard, her eyes remaining glued to the document. "I am a forensic accountant, Linda. I demand absolute financial accuracy." I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable finality. "So I drafted a counter-invoice. That document itemizes 23 years of unpaid forced domestic labor. It calculates the exact market rate for a full-time live-in housekeeper, a private chef, and a dedicated nanny for Garrett. It includes overtime hazard pay and daily compounded interest for over 2 decades of indentured servitude." I watched her eyes jump to the bold red number printed at the very bottom of the page. The invoice total was staggering. "You currently owe me $4.2 million, I stated flatly. "I know you are completely bankrupt. I know you do not have a single dime to your name. That invoice is not about collecting the money. It is a permanent physical reminder that you never owned me. You never provided for me. I paid for my own existence in that house with my blood, my sweat, and my stolen childhood. You are the one deeply, irrevocably in my debt, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life in this cage knowing you can never pay me back." Linda opened her mouth to speak a desperate, tearful apology, perhaps finally forming on her lips, but I did not give her the satisfaction of an audience. I placed the heavy black receiver back onto its metal cradle, permanently severing the connection. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my expensive suit, and turned my back on the woman who had ruined my mother's life. I did not look back as I walked out of the bleak, fluorescent-lit visiting room. I pushed through the heavy steel exit doors and stepped outside into the crisp, beautiful afternoon air. The bright sunlight instantly warmed my face, Standing in the visitor parking lot, leaning casually against a sleek black town car, was Jonathan Thorne. My uncle smiled, a genuine, fiercely proud expression that reached his eyes. He opened the passenger door for me. I walked toward my real family, leaving the shadows behind me forever. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced. Looking back on the ruins of the empire that Thomas and Linda built on my stolen life, I realized the most profound lesson wasn't about revenge or financial justice. It was about the true definition of intrinsic worth. For 32 years, I was conditioned to believe that my value was tied entirely to my utility: how well I scrubbed a floor, how quietly I endured insults, and how seamlessly I absorbed the blame for a golden child's failures. They tried to forge me into a permanent servant, hoping I would remain blind to my own strength. But here is the truth. Manipulation and abuse can obscure your identity, but they cannot erase it. The people who are meant to break you often inadvertently forge you into something unbreakable. I didn't survive their cruelty by shrinking. I survived by building my own independence, my own skills, and my own unshakable reality. I learned that family is not defined by forged paperwork or the roof over your head, and it certainly isn't an obligation to endure mistreatment. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unconditional love, and absolute truth. You do not owe your loyalty to those who view you merely as an asset to be exploited. You owe it to yourself to step out of the shadows, to calculate your own worth, and to demand exactly what you deserve. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is look your abusers in the eye, lay out the receipts of their cruelty, and walk away into a beautiful life they can never touch. Have you ever had to break free from a toxic environment or stand up to people who tried to diminish your worth? How did you find the courage to reclaim your power? Share your stories in the comments below. If my journey to justice resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that it is never too late to balance the ledger and walk into the light. Thank you for listening, and remember, your truth is your ultimate weapon.